The sky over Western Europe in late 1940 forecarried the metallic stench of cordite and the undeniable, suffocating weight of impending doom. Down in the waterlogged, freezing trenches, battle-hardened veterans of the German Wehrmacht, men who had survived the frozen, apocalyptic hellscapes of the Eastern Front and the rapid, victorious blitzkriegs across France, were gripped by a paralyzing, completely irrational terror. They were not looking up at a massive, sun-blotting fleet of four-engine strategic bombers, nor were they facing a sudden, ground-shaking stampede of heavy tanks. Instead, they were staring up at a flimsy, almost comically fragile Piper Cub observation plane, a tiny construct of canvas and light wood, circling lazily and silently in the bleak gray clouds. Whenever that small aircraft appeared, a profound, chilling silence would instantly fall over thousands of elite German infantrymen. No one dared to speak a word. No one dared to shift their weight or strike a match. They pressed their bodies desperately into the freezing, blood-stained mud of their foxholes, praying to be swallowed by the earth itself. They knew the terrifying, inescapable truth. That fragile little aircraft was the all-seeing eye of a merciless, industrialized god of war. If that lone American observer spotted even a momentary flicker of movement or the briefest glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel, within 3 minutes, the sky would physically tear open. A mathematically precise, inescapable storm of high-explosive steel would scream down from the heavens, vaporizing their entire position in a blinding flash of concussive violence. The soldiers of the United States Army fought with a cold, mechanical brutality that completely defied traditional European military comprehension. Yet, to truly understand how this nightmare reality came to be, we must examine a profound historical paradox, a violent evolution deeply explored in the historical record why Germans feared American infantry, but not British or other Allied troops. MP3. Just 2 years prior to this era of overwhelming American firepower, these very same terrified German veterans had looked upon this enemy with nothing but absolute, unrestrained, and mocking contempt. Let us rewind the clock and shift our gaze to the wind-scoured, unforgiving deserts of North Africa, specifically to the blood-soaked ends of the Kasserine Pass on February 19, 1943. The Desert Fox himself, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, stood atop a commanding sand dune, lowering his heavy field binoculars with a smirk of ultimate, vindicated satisfaction. Before him lay the highly publicized, boastful arsenal of democracy, the United States Army, in a state of catastrophic, humiliating, and total collapse. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter of the innocents. Young American boys, green troops who had never known the true, face-ripping reality of mechanized slaughter, dropped their weapons in sheer panic, abandoned pristine, factory-new tanks, and fled like a terrified flock of sheep to the merciless desert twists. In a matter of mere days, the American forces suffered a staggering 6,500 casualties, with thousands more throwing their hands into the air to surrender. Their artillery positions, supposed to be the backbone of their defense, were brutally crushed beneath the steel treads of advancing panzer divisions before they could even fire a single, coordinated volley. The entire American command structure simply disintegrated. Back in the heavily fortified, subterranean bunkers of Berlin, Adolf Hitler roared with arrogant laughter while reading the after-action reports. German military intelligence had previously ranked the military might of the United States a laughable 19th in the world, placing their combat capabilities behind minor, peripheral powers like Portugal and Romania. To the high command of the Third Reich, the United States was a genetically diluted, culturally inferior melting pot of undisciplined, soft civilians who prefer jazz music and Hollywood movies to the rigid, iron discipline required on the battlefield. Kasserine Pass seemed to prove their racist, supremacist theories perfectly correct. The man directly responsible for this American tragedy, Major General Lloyd Fred Endall, was not even on the battlefield. He was cowering in a massive, specially excavated subterranean bunkerous staggering 70 miles away from the front lines, issuing scattered, contradictory, and entirely useless orders over crackling radios, leaving his frontline units completely isolated and doomed to annihilation. Rommel wrote home to his wife that night, stating with simple, factual arrogance that the Americans had absolutely no idea how to fight a war. But the Germans made a fatal, civilization-ending miscalculation in the aftermath of that desert slaughter. They fundamentally failed to realize that the crushing, humiliating defeat at Kasserine did not break the American spirit. Rather, it served as a brutal, bloody baptism that violently awakened a dormant, mechanized Leviathan. The American military hierarchy reacted to the disaster not with despair, but with a ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency that would soon shock their enemies. The cowardly and incompetent leadership was instantly purged from the ranks, and a terrifying whirlwind of violence and uncompromising discipline arrived in the theater in the form of General George Patton. Patton descended upon the demoralized, shattered American camps in North Africa with a dictatorial, almost manic fury. He did not offer comfort, he offered the whip. He brought an atmosphere of ironclad discipline that bordered on the tyrannical. Patton demanded absolute, unquestioning perfection in every aspect of military life. Every single soldier, whether they were serving on the bleeding, violent edge of the front line or peeling potatoes in a safe, rear echelon mess tent, was strictly forced to wear a heavy steel combat helmet and a tightly knotted necktie at all times. Every piece of brass on every jeep, every buckle on every uniform, had to be polished to a blinding, mirror-like shine. It was a brutal, systematic psychological reprogramming designed to strip away the civilian's oftness. By treating every moment as a matter of life and death, Patton took terrified farm boys from Kansas and cynical city kids from Brooklyn and shoved them through a psychological meat grinder, forging them into cold, calculating killers. He forced them to discover a primal, violent thirst for victory that had been buried deep beneath their democratic upbringing. Those same young men who had wet their trousers in terror as the Stukas dive-bombed them at Kasserine suddenly discovered a dark, predatory beast within themselves under Patton's relentless psychological pressure. However, the appointment of a charismatic, aggressive general was merely the visible tip of the spear. The true terror, the underlying mechanism that fundamentally altered the psychology of the German soldier and shattered their will to fight, was an abstract, highly mathematical concept born in the quiet, academic artillery schools of Oklahoma, long before the war began. While the traditional European armies of Britain and Germany were deeply steeped in centuries of rigid, localized military tradition, the Americans brought the ruthless, optimized, unfeeling logic of the Detroit Industrial Assembly Line straight to the bloody battlefield. They created a masterstroke of organizational lethality known as the Fire Direction Center. In the British or German armies, an artillery observer crouching in a forward position could generally only communicate with and call upon the guns of his specific, localized battery. The firepower was inherently decentralized, relying on rigid hierarchies. The Americans, fueled by their obsession with communication and efficiency, wired their entire theater of war into a single, centralized, omnipotent electronic brain. A lone mud-soaked, exhausted American infantryman with a heavy field radio strapped to his back was no longer just a vulnerable rifleman. He was the conductor of a symphony of total destruction. Armed with a map and a radio frequency, he could completely bypass the tedious, time-consuming chain of command and directly summon the combined, apocalyptic fury of hundreds of heavy artillery pieces across entire divisions and corps. This unparalleled communication network gave birth to the most psychologically devastating and physically destructive artillery tactic of the entire Second World War, a concept known simply and terrifyingly as time on target. Traditionally, in the history of warfare, artillery barrages arrived in a staggered, predictable rhythm. The first ranging shell would scream through the air and explode, and seasoned German veterans relying on years of combat instincts would use those precious few seconds of warning to dive into their deep dugouts and reinforced bunkers. The American time on target protocol erased those life-saving seconds from the fabric of existence. Deep behind the lines, inside the bustling fire direction centers, American officers acting like industrial managers, armed with slide rules, weather charts, and communication grids, calculated the exact flight times of shells originating from varying distances, varying calibers, and varying elevations. They factored in wind speed, barometric pressure, and the temperature of the gunpowder. Then, they issued highly synchronized, precise firing orders to dozens of different batteries scattered across miles of terrain, ensuring that hundreds of massive artillery rounds would be fired at completely different times, trace entirely different parabolic arcs through the sky, and detonate on the exact same coordinate at the exact same devastating millisecond. For the German soldiers on the receiving end of this mathematical nightmare, it was a sudden, apocalyptic event that offered no chance of survival. There was no warning whistle, no escalating crescendo of bombardment. One moment, the dense European forest was silent, save for the chirping of birds and the quiet murmurs of sentries. The very next millisecond, a concentrated, blinding hurricane of fire, jagged steel, and organ-rupturing concussive force simply erased a square mile of the earth. Entire panzer companies, heavily armored convoys, and deeply entrenched infantry battalions were instantly vaporized, turned to pink mist and twisted scrap metal without a single defensive shot being fired. German prisoners of war, men who had proudly marched through the Arc de Triomphe, wept openly and uncontrollably during interrogations with American intelligence officers. They called this method of warfare an unfair, barbaric, and soulless slaughter. Their vaunted tactical superiority, their years of rigorous training, their elite bloodlines, meant absolutely nothing when the very oxygen around them could be turned to superheated plasma at a moment's notice by an invisible enemy miles away. The terror of the American military machine was further compounded by a terrifying hybrid of overwhelming industrial output and a ruthless, grassroots, bottom-up culture of innovation. The rigid, aristocratic German military structure demanded that any tactical adaptation or mechanical modification be formally submitted, reviewed, and approved by high-ranking theorists and engineering bureaus back in Berlin, a process that took months. In stark contrast, the American Army was filled with working-class mechanics, civilian welders, and garaged inkerers who viewed a deadly battlefield problem the exact same way they viewed a broken tractor or a stalled Ford engine back home. When the massive Allied invasion force smashed into the lush Norman countryside in the bloody summer of 1944, they collided head-on with the deadly, impenetrable Bocage. These ancient, towering hedgerows, painstakingly built by French farmers over centuries, were woven with thick, iron-hard roots and packed with dense earth, turning the picturesque landscape into a lethal, compartmentalized labyrinth. German forces, masters of defensive warfare, utilized this terrain perfectly. They hid their deadly 88mm anti-tank guns and MG-40 to machine gun nests deep within the thick brush. Whenever an advancing American Sherman tank attempted to push through or climb over the massive earthen walls, its front would rear up, exposing its thin, highly vulnerable underbelly armor to point-blank, armor-piercing rounds. The American advance, supposed to be a lightning strike, ground to a bloody, agonizing, and costly halt, with burning tanks littering the narrow country lanes. The German army, overcoming this strategic nightmare, would have required a massive pause in operations and a top-secret directive from the Heikel, and to develop a new specialized vehicle. In the American Army, the solution came from a simple, uncelebrated sergeant named Kurt the Skulin. Staring at the massive, twisted steel obstacles the Germans had desperately planted on the invasion beaches to tear the bottoms out of landing craft, Skulin had a profoundly violent and brilliantly simple realization. Why try to blindly climb over the impenetrable wall when you can just cut straight through its heart? Skulin gathered his unit's mechanics, fired up their acetylene welding torches, and began violently cutting the heavy German steel beams, grafting them like jagged, prehistoric fangs onto the front hulls of their Sherman tanks. These newly christened Rhino tanks did not hesitate or slow down when they hit the ancient hedgerows. The drivers revved their massive aviation engines and drove their steel fangs deep into the earthen banks, violently ripping through centuries of intertwined roots and bursting through the other side in a terrifying explosion of dirt, rocks, and splintered timber. German anti-tank crews, waiting for the tank to climb, work rushed beneath the treads or buried in debris before they even realized the impenetrable wall had been violently breached. And the true, soul-crushing horror for the Germans was the sheer industrial speed of the American response to this invention. There was no waiting for official blueprints, no bureaucratic approval from Washington. The word spread from unit to unit, and every maintenance depot and mobile repair shop across the Normandy beachhead began sparking with the blinding light of welding torches day and night. Within a matter of mere weeks, over 3,000 American tanks had sprouted these brutal steel fangs. The Americans had literally dismantled the German coastal defenses and used that very same steel to aggressively tear apart the German inland defenses. The American army was not a rigid machine. It was a highly adaptive, biological ecosystem of destruction that evolved with terrifying, unstoppable speed. Once the ancient hedgerows were shattered and the German defensive lines were irrevocably broken, the resulting American breakout was a spectacle of hyper-mechanized violence that the world had never seen. The subsequent offensive severed the German lines entirely, and General Patton's Third Army surged across the French countryside with a velocity that rendered traditional military maps and strategic planning entirely obsolete. The German war machine, despite its terrifying reputation and menacing propaganda, was still heavily reliant on an archaic logistical system, using hundreds of thousands of draft horses to slowly pull its supply wagons through the muddened ruin. The Americans, however, waged war with a logistical dominance that defied human logic and broke the spirit of their enemies. To fuel their rapid advance, they birthed the legendary Reed Ball Express, a relentless, looping, unending convoy of thousands of heavy transport trucks thundered down the scarred French highways 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, headlights blazing through the night in defiance of German aircraft. Exhausted American drivers, pushing the limits of human endurance, lashed their own hands to the steering wheels with ropes to keep from falling asleep as they hurled tens of tons of heavy ammunition, combat rations, and highly volatile aviation fuel toward the bleeding, ever-advancing edge of the front lines. It was an endless, mechanized river of lifeblood feeding a roaring monster that never stopped consuming territory. This logistical supremacy meant that every single artillery shell produced in the massive, untouched foundries of Ohio fit perfectly into the breech of a gun forged in the roaring factories of Michigan. When a German Eiger tank was finally destroyed after a bitter fight, it was a permanent, irreplaceable loss of elite manpower and incredibly scarce machinery for the crumbling Reich. But when an American Sherman tank was destroyed, leaving its crew dead or wounded in a burning husk, a brand new tank, fully fueled, fully loaded with ammunition, and manned by fresh recruits, was driven off a transport ship at the docks and delivered directly to the front lines almost immediately. The German generals slowly realized with sinking hearts that they were not fighting a conventional army of men. They were fighting the entire, fully mobilized gross domestic product of the North American continent, rolling toward them at 60 miles an hour, burying them under a mountain of mass-produced steel. As the bitter, freezing winter of 1944 wrapped its icy, unforgiving fingers around the war-torn continent of Europe, the Americans unleashed yet another classified, technological nightmare upon the freezing German infantry. They introduced the proximity fuse, a closely guarded secret weapon that fundamentally altered the brutal arithmetic of battlefield survival. For centuries of human conflict, an artillery shell had to physically strike a solid object or slam into the ground to trigger its detonator. If a German soldier dug a deep enough trench or buried himself at the bottom of a narrow foxhole, he had a highly reasonable chance of surviving even the heaviest bombardment, provided the shell did not land directly on top of him. The proximity fuse erased that hope completely. Deep within the hard nose cone of each specialized shell lay a miniaturized, highly resilient, and incredibly complex radar transfer. As the artillery shell screamed through the freezing winter air, it broadcast a continuous, invisible radio wave toward the earth below. When the shell reached a precise, predetermined altitude of roughly 50 feet above the ground, the returning, bouncing signal triggered the internal detonator. The results on the battlefield were unspeakably gruesome and psychologically shattering. Thousands of heavy artillery shells no longer buried themselves in the mud to explode, they detonated in mid-air, directly over the heads of the exposed German trenches. A hypervelocity, downward sweeping rain of jagged, red-hot steel shrapnel showered down with inescapable, omnidirectional lethality. There was nowhere to hide. The very dense, ancient forests that had previously provided excellent camouflage and cover now became active instruments of death as the massive air bursts violently splintered the tops of the pine trees, sending razor-sharp, heavy wood shrapnel tearing through the flesh and bone of the German defenders huddled below. Foxholes were no longer safe havens, they were instantly transformed into open mass graves. The deadly effectiveness and lethality of American artillery increased exponentially overnight, turning the snowy, picturesque battlefields of Europe into a horrific, blood-soaked butcher's yard of red, ice and shredded uniforms. Yet, despite this overwhelming avalanche of firepower and logistics, the fanatical Nazi regime refused to accept its inevitable demise quietly. In the dark, freezing, and miserable December of 1944, Adolf Hitler, completely detached from reality, gambled the final, desperate reserves of the Third Reich in the dense, unforgiving terrain of the Ardennes forest. Masked by a massive, blinding winter blizzard that completely grounded the dreaded, omnipresent American tactical air power, the finest remaining German panzer armies launched a devastating, all-out surprise offensive. In the initial, chaotic, and terrifying days of the massive assault, the thinly stretched American lines violently buckled under the immense pressure. Thousands of green, inexperienced American replacements were abruptly killed or captured in the freezing fog. German steel tracks once again rolled over American positions, and it seemed that the humiliating ghost of Kasserine Pass had returned. The crisis reached its absolute peak when the elite American 101st Airborne Division was completely surrounded and cut off. The temperature plummeted well below freezing. Ammunition supplies dwindled to virtually nothing. Medical supplies vanished completely. The paratroopers were freezing, lacking proper winter gear, and entirely cut off from the outside world while German tanks echoed nearby. Confident of their absolute, impending victory, the local German commander formally dispatched an envoy under a white flag of truce. The envoy delivered a pompous, highly formal typewritten ultimatum demanding the immediate, honorable, and unconditional surrender. They threatened total annihilation by massed heavy artillery if the surrounded American garrison unfoolishly refused the strict demands. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McCall, read the arrogant translation, and issued a single word of response: nuts. It was a spectacular, deeply American insult that completely baffled the German translators trying to understand its formal meaning. But more than that, it was the ultimate, unbreakable expression of contempt from a military force that had been forged in blazing fires. Those young American boys, freezing to death in the Belgian snow, facing overwhelming odds, did not take a single step backward. They dug their foxholes deeper into the frozen earth, gripped their freezing, ice-covered rifles, and prepared to bleed the German armor. Simultaneously, far to the south, General George Patton was furiously orchestrating a strategic maneuver deemed a logistical impossibility. He received the desperate call for help from Bastogne and ordered his massive Third Army to completely disengage from the eastern enemy. In the middle of a blinding blizzard, he commanded an entire army group to pivot 90 degrees and march over 100 miles northward. In a stunning display of organizational genius and raw industrial power, hundreds of thousands of men executed this flawless, massive pivot. When Patton's vanguard shattered the dense winter fog and violently smashed into the rear of the unsuspecting German siege lines, it was over. The Americans had achieved the impossible through sheer willpower and logistical supremacy. After the endless bombardment finally ceased, the dust settled over the ruined cities of Europe. Captured German generals sat in stark rooms. Staring at the floor, they admitted that they had fundamentally, disastrously misunderstood the true nature of the American war machine. The absolute terror of the American infantry was not born from fanatical, political ideology or centuries of rigid, aristocratic tradition. The terror came from facing an opponent that learned from its bloody failures at a terrifying, almost biological speed. It came from an army that possessed the brutal, mathematical efficiency to coordinate mass destruction on a scale never before seen. The Germans realized far too late to save their nation that they had not engaged in a traditional war of maneuver. From the humiliating, blood-stained sands of the Kasserine Pass to the absolute dominance at the crossing of the Rhine River, they proved a truth. The grinding, merciless reality of modern industrial warfare, tactical arrogance and rigid military tradition will always be crushed to dust. The German army did not just learn to fear the American infantryman. In his foxhole, they learned to fear the terrifying, mechanized future of warfare itself. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history as deadliest military innovations, hit that subscribe button. I am your battlefield historian, and I will see you on the next frontline.